So I promise I won't go too long. I'll speak for maybe 20, 25 minutes, and then afterwards you can ask some questions, but also feel free to ask some questions during the presentation if you like as well. And don't be ashamed of nodding off and sleeping. I get plenty of students sleeping in my class. I'm used to it. I'll just keep walking around and speaking, regardless anyway. So my name's Michael Hauser. I'll give you a short presentation. Part of my, I'm actually on furlough leave at the moment. Every 2 years, I've been in Papua New Guinea for 2.5 years. And every 2 years, I have to come home for 2 months, which is kind of cool. It sounds like a holiday, but it's actually not. I have to go around to different congregations and speak and be a face for the Lutheran Church of Mission. Unfortunately, this is the only face I have. I can't change it. And it is actually, also unfortunately, it's the only face in the Lutheran Church who works full-time overseas at the moment. When I first went over to Papua New Guinea, we had 4 of us there under the guidance of the Lutheran Church of Australia. Myself, Hannah Schultz, Bible translator, some of you might know Hannah, Pastor Greg Schiller, and also a fellow by the name of Nick Schwartz, who's working in the LCA Bishop's office now. They have all come back, except for Hannah still there, but her administrative parts of the church, they have shifted her over to Wycliffe International, and so the church is not directly responsible for Hannah's sent mission over in Papua New Guinea, but we still claim her as a Lutheran and are able to support her as a church. My presentation is just simply titled Sent to Serve. I'm not a technology whiz, so it's not got bells and whistles on it. I'll just simply speak to some pictures. But before I do that, I'll just share some of my journey into how you might get over to Papua New Guinea. I certainly, like many people who find themselves in ministry for the church, they certainly have this, well, I never thought I would do it, such a thing. And certainly that was the case for me. I had been to PNG before, back in 2009, with Australian Lutheran World Service. We went over there on a teacher study tour. Susan Sang took us over there, and I really enjoyed the country. I had known Papua New Guinean people through my schooling. I went to boarding school at St. Peter's Lutheran College, and my best friend is actually Papua New Guinean, who I've been able to catch up with since I've been over there, which has been fantastic. So my links with the country were there, and at that time I was working at St. Peter's Lutheran College. Not long after that, I was beginning to be called, in a sense, although at the time I didn't know that call. And I was called just with having questions and questioning church, questioning theology. And in particular, I had a question about baptism. And I went and spoke with the chaplain who was there at the time, who's now the Bishop of Queensland, Bishop Paul Smith. And I remember not being happy with his answer. I can't remember his answer. But then after our discussion, he gave me the Book of Concord to go away and read. And it's like, who does that? Not many people will give you the Book of Concord to go away and read because they're scared that it's too heavy. But I read it, and it was like scales falling from my eyes, in a certain sense. Okay? I could see the gospel there. I needed to hear the gospel at that time. I could all of a sudden, the gospel message was presented to me in a different way. And I asked the question, why? I've been brought up in the Lutheran church all my life. I've worked in Lutheran schools. And why don't I hear this? Why don't I hear this preached? And it's coming down the road a little bit further. It's actually, sometimes we can be very critical about what's happening in our church, and we should should be. We should critique our own church, but it was also with what was going on here. My heart was hard for a long time, even though I was in the church. All of a sudden, I was this good soil for the gospel message to be planted in my heart. And it's actually given me a real appreciation of Lutheran theology. I won't apologise for being Lutheran and being Lutheran in my theology. I'm proud in the sense that the reformers, in particular Martin Luther, were all about the gospel message. And that's really important, I think, for all of us, and particularly in my work here, as I'll explain in a little while. Before I do that, I'll just encourage you very much in gathering here and digging deeper into our theology. Okay, many of you, Lutheran theology is not just easy. It doesn't just fall into you, and you won't understand it straight away. But we chew on it like we chew on the word. Luther tells us to chew on the word when he speaks about meditation. He literally is saying, eat it, chew it, run it round in your mouth, and speak it back to yourself, backwards and forwards. Okay, many of the things that you're presented to you, we struggle with. In particular, one thing I was thinking about. It was great for me to be here and listen to my cohort, because I studied with these fellows down at ALC, going over again, being refreshed myself in many of the things that I do teach up there, in slightly different ways, of course, in a classroom. But what you have covered this morning, I want to tell you, takes me 3, 4, maybe 5 weeks to go through. So you need to stretch it out in your life, and you do begin to live it. You remember things as you go along, and it'll just maybe come out of the blue, things that were presented to you this weekend, and it becomes real for us. So I'll just encourage you with that. Keep at it, even though you're going to have some heavy sessions, I'm sure, the next 2 days still. Okay, so Papua New Guinea, I've got there in the byline, a struggle for the gospel. And it's the same struggle that we've had as a Reformed church, struggling for the gospel, is found in Papua New Guinea today. We might look at Papua New Guinea with 1.5 million Lutherans and think that it's such a successful church, vibrant, living, growing. The missionaries did such a great job. I mean, there's 7 million people in Papua New Guinea, 95% Christian. The missionaries did such a great job. But like in all situations, we want to see a change in people, a transformation, the gospel and the practice of it. And Papua New Guinea, as many of you probably know, still has lots of struggles in terms of how the gospel works out in the lives of people, and also in terms of their reiterating it, repeating the gospel, learning the gospel and speaking it, because the gospel can morph and change, unfortunately, sometimes with new influences, synergy. There's lots of backsliding, going back into sorcery and witchcraft at the moment. We're seeing all sorts of things. I'm surprised mainstream media here hasn't picked up on some of the torturing of accused witches in the country. It's a real problem at the moment. There's a Lutheran missionary from LCMS up in the Highlands who has done some good work with this and reporting it through Facebook. Actually, he uses it to get the message out. That's the only way he can do it. If anybody's interested. But lots of caution in looking and searching that on Facebook, because there are some images that can be quite disturbing. Literally, they'll tape it and put it on YouTube. People being tortured and put to death. So up in this picture here, this was taken at the Synod. There's about Synod 2 years ago. There's 5,000 people there. And I just spoke to you about the use of new technology, one of a terrible use, but there's, you see in this picture, this fellow's holding about 4 phones, taking pictures there. He's got a phone. I was amazed when I went there how many people and how this new technology has come into the country. It's an example just of how quickly a culture can change and adapt. And they're still trying to catch up in terms of how to use these things in a proper way, as we are here in Australia. These pictures, series of pictures were taken. When I went to Papua New Guinea, I had to do 6 months what they call orientation. Orientation is about learning about the culture. And part of that, I had to travel around the culture, the country, and to experience some of it. And these pictures are taken up in Yalibu, which is higher than any village in Australia. It's higher than Perisher. I think Perisher is one of the highest places in Australia. Yalibu's higher, and it's very cold. Those of you who know me know that I don't like the cold so much. I really struggled up in Yalibu. I was up there with a fellow named Pastor Penga Nimbo. This is Penga here and Penga here. Penga did some study down at ALC as well. You might remember Penga. He's in Germany now, yes. He's pastoring in Germany, yeah. You saw him there, yeah. I got to stay in his village, Kendall village, and we were just having a picnic there this day, driving around a big man's vehicle. We had to wash it before we returned it back to him and have a wash in the creek. The creek was freezing cold, but this was one of the very fine days, nice and warm. This picture here, this is Penga's car, Pastor Penga's car, and it kind of speaks into the Papua Guinean way. It's very similar to Aboriginal culture in a way. Anybody seen bush mechanics? Right, yeah. Where there's a will, there's a way kind of thing. Well, this car is being held together by masking tape. I wouldn't advise taking a trip in it, except that the only other option is to go for a walk into town. So this fellow here is obviously in a Sing Sing dress. I joke that you wouldn't want to run into this guy in a dark alley. He looks pretty scary. I had the pleasure of going to see a Sing Sing, or they call it Kalap, a dancing ceremony, where it was a compensation ceremony. It was very interesting because there's kind of a pageantry involved in it. There's a competition. I liken it to, today we have The Voice, etc., where we comment on it very much about the performance of the people. We give feedback. The same thing happens here. It's quite funny as an observer watching these things and some of the things that go on. These guys are so serious in their marching around. They are literally marching around like this, and they'll stop, and then these old ladies will run out and they'll throw a cigarette in the mouth, so they'll stand up nice and straight, like the guards over in London, and they don't move, and they suck in the smoke and blow it out, and then they'll come and take it and give it to the next person. These kinds of things happening, and then they'll run out of soft drink and give them a drink, Really interesting, and I was the only white skin for a long way. It was quite an honour to be able to go and experience something like that. The compensation ceremonies happen a little bit because they don't have any insurance like we do. There's no social welfare system in Papua New Guinea. They have a system called a Wontok system. Some of you might have heard of that, and that's very much where you rely upon your family and your links with your own language groups. And this particular compensation ceremony was, they were paying something like 150,000 kina because somebody from one village had run over a small child from another village. And so this was kind of this life insurance happening. And it wasn't just that village that was paying the money, it was some of the surrounding villages as well. And it wasn't just money, it was pigs and goods as well. This ceremony, there was at least 30 pigs sitting there. 30 pigs is worth about 30,000 kina up there in the highlands. A very interesting culture to experience. Down the bottom here we have some, I like to go fishing. This is one of the first times I went fishing there. And I caught one or two little ones, but these young pickaninnies were very keen on showing me how they go fishing. They are very keen to and very proud of who they are, and they love the outsider coming in so that they can walk you around the place. It gives them great status to have an honoured person walking with them. It's an honour-shame culture, as we were talking this morning, which creates lots of problems. I won't go into all of them, but I call myself a white skin because that's what they call me. For a white skin walking around the place, it creates a lot of problems because it actually gets quite confusing at times. You don't quite know what's going on, and it's because a little bit because it's an honour-shame culture happening all the time. This is my place of work. I lecture at Martin Luther Seminary, and I lecture in systematic theology, is what you would know it over there. We just call it doctrine. So I'll teach Doctrine 1 and 2 and teach ethics there. It's interesting that a white skin will teach ethics in Papua New Guinea. I also teach some Hebrew, introductory Hebrew though, Josh. You probably know Hebrew much better than me now. So this is our campus. In the centre there, of course, is the chapel. We have about, at this seminary, we have about 80 to 90 students, and many of them will be married and they'll have family there, and so our community is about 300 strong. There are 3 seminaries in Papua New Guinea. They have 2 Tok Pisin seminaries. They're all about the same size. This seminary is in Lae, and it is an English-speaking seminary. So my teaching can be in English, thankfully. My Tok Pisin hasn't come along as well as what it should, mostly because I can actually speak and get around in Lae using English. Down the bottom here we have the inside of the chapel. We have a lovely chapel full of a couple of wood carvings around the sides and a wood carved altar with a cross suspending in the middle. They have a lovely big shell as the baptismal font. And they are they're very spiritual people, very spiritual people. One of the things that attracted me to go there once I was asked to go was just knowing that the people are how spiritual they are. There's no, you don't have to get into apologetics there in terms of trying to prove God's existence, as has been the case in the last 20, 30 years in our culture. So that discussion doesn't necessarily need to take place. As I said, 95% Christian, but that kind of atheism is starting to break through, particularly in the higher business world, where the money comes in and science, etc., comes into the country. But it means that the engagement with Papua New Guineans, a lot of the discussion these days is very much about interdenominational understanding. So there's still lots of missionaries going into the country. The Lutheran Church has pulled back. We used to have 120 Australian missionaries up there. Now, as I've said, I'm the only one from Australia. But Germany in particular had heaps, a whole lot. And now we've kind of got, in ELC PNG, we have close to 30 full-time missionaries working in the country. So we've pulled back, and while we've pulled back, a lot of the other Protestant churches have increased, particularly from America. So that causes a lot of interesting discussion. And it also causes a lot of tension in families, because traditionally missionaries would leave areas alone. The Lutheran Church would be in this village, the next village would be the Anglican Church, next village might be something else. And they would just leave them alone. They wouldn't try and sheep steal that, so to speak. But these days, as the territory has filled up with Christians, what has happened is that lots of denominations, particularly ones that believe that they are the true church above all the others, come in, and their church mission is to come in, and one of the first things they say, well, that's not the real church. The Lutheran Church is not the real church, we're the real church. That's one of the first things that they'll do, and then they'll start to fill out their teaching, perhaps in a different way. So that's in particular one of the battles that we have there. Yes?
Is there any church that doesn't, if they're honest, doesn't say we're the real church, everyone else is not?
We confess we're the one church. Yes? Apostolic Church, Catholic Church. Yeah. In that sense, we confess that we're the real church, yes. Yeah. So we join with all those brothers, yeah. Sorry. This one here. This is one of my classes. I can't remember which class it was. It may have been Hebrew. But one of the things that you kind of putting it straight, because I'm white, I go in there and it's like a white person, you can ask him to do anything and he'll be pretty good at doing it, you know. You get handed a lot of jobs that you probably wouldn't here. I mean, for me in particular, it's actually quite an honour and privilege to be there, because I'm not a pastor, and I'm teaching pastors. I'm a lay theologian for the time being. I'm also not a doctor. I'm not a master's holder, but a BTH honours degree holder. So that they kind of send me over there, and I'm able to teach there. But in particular, one of the things that I found myself teaching is Hebrew. And I wouldn't necessarily say that I'm cut out to teach Hebrew. But the way that it happened was like, oh yeah, we really need a Hebrew teacher this year. Mick, can you do it? And I was sort of like, well, I'm already full up in my load that I'm supposed to do for my first year. Is there somebody else? No, there's nobody else. So, okay. So I asked them, how many students am I going to have? Oh, well, last time we had a Hebrew, there was only 2 or 3 students. I was like, okay, that sounds all right. I can do that. I had 26 turn up to my first class. I had 10 books. Yeah, I was, thrown into the deep end. I often get thrown into the deep end. In mission situations, you do that. It tends to happen quite a bit. By the grace of God, you struggle through, and I found a way to get through Hebrew. You only ever have to be a chapter in front of your students. You don't need to know the whole textbook. You only need one chapter in front. So these pictures are kind of around town pictures. Up the top there, PNG is resource rich. Mining industry is the biggest industry up there, of course, and I'm actually panning for gold in one of the streams there in a coconut shell. I was not very successful. There's a gold mine just up the way from this place, Walpu Gold Mine. The place it's incredible, the amount of money that's in the ground, so to speak, the resources in the ground. I had a student come to me, and I've had people, again, because I'm a white skin, they think I know everything about gold, so they come and ask me, oh, do you buy gold? Do you know how much it is in the supermarket? And he's got a little flask full of gold flecks in there, wanting me to give him a good price for his gold. A student comes to me with a rock like this, thinking it's a diamond, you know. Mister, can you tell me whether this is a diamond? Very interesting. They find and pick up things in their rivers and in their places. It's quite amazing, the worth that's in the hills of Papua New Guinea. But sadly, they get a fraction of the cost that gets pulled out of the ground. Lots of corruption up the top means that not a lot of the money doesn't filter through to the people, and as is always the case, mining companies will try and bang for your buck kind of thing. They're trying to make as much money as what they can. This picture here, this is what's called a billum. Anybody want to have a guess at what's inside that billum? The one up the top here in the middle, this kind of dangling down. It's a baby, yeah. There's his feet there. His head's around there somewhere. Can't really quite see it. They carry everything around their billums, in their billums. And in particular, the men have billums, but they don't have very big billums. Their billums are about this big. They carry the money, see. The women carry the heavy load. Like this lady down the bottom here. She's got a greens in there going off to the market, most likely to sell her goods. And this is one of the only ways that the people can actually make money in terms of economy. They've got plenty in terms of they grow their own things. You actually don't need any money in Papua New Guinea when you live in a village. It is so rich and fertile place. Everything grows. You stick a stick in the ground and it starts growing. Literally, that's how they plant hedges. It's very rich, but because there's lots of new things, new materials, building materials in particular, of building homes and houses, they want to try and make money, and the only way they can do it is marketing goods. So they'll travel some distance to go to markets, little markets that pop up on the sides of the roads, etc., to do their work. The men, the lady will be walking in front, and the men will be walking sometimes a little bit in front or a long way back, and they'll be just carrying one big bush knife. Traditionally, their role as men is as protectors, and so they would often have their spears or their bush knives walking around the place. You will never see them, you will very rarely see them walk together. In fact, it took me 2 years to work out of the staff members, the men, who the wives were, because I never saw them together, and I never actually introduced them to me. You just had to kind of work it out. So the disparity in the roles is a long way different from here. As a single man working up there, it means I have to be very careful. I tell a funny story. Pastor Greg Schiller got married off to somebody because he said hello to her. And a week later, the principal called him in and said, "Oh, you getting married to the receptionist?" And he said, "What? No." And he worked out that she had told everybody that they were getting married. Greg was interested in her because he had said hello to her. And we try not to wave or anything like that. You put your hands in your pockets, walk around. I have to walk in front of the women when I walk down the road. When I have a cleaner, and she comes to my house, I'm a typical bachelor. She comes to my house, but when she's there, I'm not in the house. I can't, man and woman inside the house, they're married. I can't be in there with her, within reason. If anybody sees me in there with her, immediately the rumour goes around that, we're married off. It's interesting. Which is why this picture's here, because you never really see that physical contact between a male and female in public. It could be that these are their brother and sister. I don't know, but it's just a talking point on that in particular thing. My sister here, my darling sister Jodie, she came and visited last year in April. We went on a trip. We're on the back of a troopy there, a ute, and I put my sister in there with her permission, sort of, because this particular day, it's actually quite daunting. It can be daunting. You're going into places, literally, where people haven't seen white people for a long time. I went to one particular place and there hadn't been a white skin there for 15 years, which meant that there are lots of kids there that never been to town, never seen a white skin. So what do you think that they do? They just crowd around and look. And I'm an introverted person, very shy. This is out of the ordinary, me getting up and speaking, but it's daunting and it takes a lot of energy out of you. My sister, she had a bit of a breakdown that night because she gets self-conscious about all sorts of things, and people are looking at me all the time, looking at me. And she didn't even twig for her that they were looking because she's white. Because she's white. It kind of is a lesson in identity in terms of the self-reflection that we kind of have a lot. Moving across cultures kind of starts to bring those things out. You become very self-conscious, at least initially, and working through the culture takes a long time to get used to that. Last set of slides, because I've gone a bit too long. These pictures are taken on Tami Island. The first one again is the resourcefulness of Papua New Guineans. This is a grave site on the island. The island is one of the first places that the German missionaries went in around Finchhaven back in the 1880s. And what do you think these are around the grave sites? Anybody? Coconut husk, clothes? No. Beer bottles. Correct. They are beer bottles that whiteskins have left behind. And they are now the bilas of the grave sites. Again, resourcefulness. They'll use pretty much anything and everything to make stuff. I'm just acting the fool there with two pickaninnies that have become kind of like an adopted family on the island. I've been to the island quite a few times. I'll go and do my cultural immersion there. I call it cultural immersion, but it's really a break from lay. I get to really intensely learn the language there because they won't speak English to me. So I have to speak Tok Pisin when I go to the island there. In the middle here, we have a real picture of church and state and Luther in the middle. Because on this hand we have the principal of Martin Luther Seminary, and this fellow here is the Prime Minister of the country, and he came to our graduating ceremony. Much to my kind of chagrin actually, and I'll explain that maybe in a little while. And this fellow down here was a gift that we gave to the Prime Minister. It's a Martin Luther carving, which we commissioned from somebody from Tami Island. The last picture is, I'll read it out for you. It's a grave plaque of the first Tami Islanders to be baptised in 1902. Joseph Karaka was the chief. He was born early 1886 and died 22nd of March 1971. Now, it's very quite an interesting story about they had 10, 15 years of mission work there, and the baptism is generally regarded as the benchmark for whether you've had conversions, etc. And they didn't have many until one fellow by the name of Christian Kaiser decided, okay, I'm going to go for the chief. So he went for the chief, and eventually, through a period of time and actually working through sorcery and witchcraft, and interestingly, through repentance, there was a period of repentance. He got a whole heap of chiefs together where they openly admitted to each other that they were trying to kill each other with witchcraft. He announced forgiveness in the name of Jesus Christ, and a couple of days later, one of the chiefs wanted to be baptised. As soon as the chief was baptised, the rest of the rest of the village got baptized, and bang, the gospel went like wildfire through the country. Really interesting. Right at that point of confession, absolution, forgiveness of sins. So I'll tie up my presentation there and ask for questions. But particularly, I'll just remind you and thank you for your support. Sometimes in the presentations, people go, "Oh, our support, we don't know you. How are we supporting you?" But in your prayers, this is one of your first steps as missionaries, and one of your responses that we were talking about this morning is that in prayer, you remember yourselves, but you're not only praying for yourself, you pray for the church and pray for the whole world. And so particularly I'd like to thank you for your prayer and ask for your continued support in that. Now you know my face. You can pray for a new one for me. And yes. I'll finish my presentation there and ask for questions before we nod off for sleep. Chloe, right? Yeah.
What was the story that you were alluding to with the Martin Luther carving and the Prime Minister?
Yep. So church and state's always an interesting discussion. And so in my classes, I'll be, of course, teaching about it in ethics and doctrine classes. And they have a great discussion publicly. And often the students will want to speak about how the church shouldn't do this and the church shouldn't do that. Well, one of the things is this fellow's a Lutheran guy, and many of the politicians actually are Lutheran, and they come from Lutheran areas, and the politicians will attach themselves to the big church events. Just recently, a couple of weeks ago, we had our next synod, this year's synod, and the Prime Minister was there again, and they'll often come into the places and they'll give money. And this is one of the reasons why they invite them. So the students were very critical of their own church, of inviting politicians to church events. And yet, this is what happened here. They invited the Prime Minister. And I was kind of critiquing, why are you doing that? And I was quite frustrated with them actually, because they, at the critical time, and it's kind of a lesson for me in terms of how hard it is to break from a tradition of what you do. How hard it is for them. They can engage with it and critique it and say that it's wrong, but at the vital moment, they step back into it, and we're very happy for him to come, and he promised us to give us 2 million kina. So they got what they wanted in the end. That's very much why they do it. I was quite a little frustrated with it, to be quite honest. Okay, because it's not just the students who talk about it; it's the wider church that talks about it. But then they're all very happy for these guys to turn up and throw cargo at them. It's a particular problem that they have. But in Australia here, we would love a few more politicians owning up to being Christian, right? And actually coming to church.
Right, Mick, thanks for that. 2 quick questions. First, in terms of receiving a call like knowing you, probably that was a struggle. Would you like to share a bit of how did you arrive at a clarity of the call? Secondly, what role does confession and absolution, what sort of a role does it play in your own life as a missionary?
Confession, absolution.
Yeah, in terms of receiving God's grace and forgiveness as you do the work.
Okay. Well, the first one's a little easier than the second one, but it's also related to the call, right? So, of course, confession, absolution in my life personally is everything. The forgiveness of sins is the kernel of the gospel. That's the nutshell. If you don't have that, the rest is just a theology of glory. It's wanting cargo, wanting blessings to shower down from God, etc. We don't have the forgiveness of sins. particularly in Papua New Guinea, I mentioned the struggle for the gospel. They have their culture, and every culture is very legalistic. They have a sliding back into legalism. They're quite a legalistic church, which is not strange, by the way, for a church which has become cultural Christianity. It tends to become legalistic. And so from the pulpit, you tend to hear, this is what you have to do as a good Christian, because they see Christians drinking in the street. Everybody knows each other's business over in Papua New Guinea. So the gospel, in terms of the preaching of forgiveness of sins, you don't hear it so much at the pulpit. But thank the Lord that it comes through the sacraments and is preached in the sacrament. You miss it in the sermon. You might get it in the Bible readings if your ears are tuned to picking up this law-gospel distinction. But it's certainly there, spoken and preached to us through the sacraments. And I thank God for that, because after 6 months being there, I went to the Dean of Studies and said, I just want to hear the gospel. I haven't heard it yet preached to me. In 6 months I've been here. And in terms of the call, that's as simply reiterating that and confessing that as a confession of faith is as simple as the call needs to be for me. The only thing that changes for me is my context. So I'm here confessing that faith. I'm in Papua New Guinea confessing that faith. I was in Perth just before Christmas, the same thing, doing a presentation. So that kind of gets carried with you, and that's as simple as the call is for me. You can go wider than that, of course, but I tend to get, when I worry about things too much, I tend to struggle a bit with that. By the way, I haven't shared this with the pastors that are here, the guys that I studied with. I was always very much not wanting to be a pastor. I don't want to be a pastor. I'm just happy to learn Lutheran theology. It's taken me to get to Papua New Guinea to see the need for me to be able to preach now. And just recently I was given permission to go along the pathway to ordination. Even though I would still struggle, I think, being a pastor in my own context. But pastoring in Papua New Guinea is slightly different in terms of the expectations that are there on pastors. And in my particular context in the seminary, because I'm working in an oral tradition and culture, it is actually important for me to begin to preach from the pulpit. So they've asked me to do that, and they wanted to ordain me over there. And Australia said, no, you can't do that. I've got to be cleansed a little bit more. There's a few things that I need to do before they'll ordain me.
Slightly similar question to what you're just talking about. Who do you belong to? Do you belong to the LCA still?
Yes.
Or do you belong to ELC PNG?
Technically, yes. I think that kind of answer, when I started to ask the questions about ordination, because the PNG said, oh, we'll just ordain you. ELC PNG is a very pragmatic church. They're not very interested in dogma, church dogma. And since the missionaries came, they have just basically followed what they were taught. But that's starting to get quite loose, because that's kind of at least 40 years ago, they've had 40 years of independence in their church. And so they don't quite understand church dogma, office of ministry and all that kind of thing. But it was when I started asking the questions of my people in charge of me that they eventually said, no, you can't do that. Oh, you can do that actually, but if you do, you're not employed by the LCA. I'm no longer a member of the church in Australia. I'm a member of Papua New Guinea Church. Which raises an interesting theological question about membership in a church, but we won't go there.
Just quickly, you said, mentioned about the differences between being a pastor in PNG and a pastor in this context, what would you say those differences are in terms of expectations?
The pastors here are expected to do a lot more pastoral care and counselling outside the divine service. So they've got to visit hospital, or depending on where they are, the expectations are different in places, but the training has to be across a broad range of things. Hospital care and counselling, sick and the dying, you've got schools, etc., etc., and that list could probably go on and on. That type of thing, in terms of pastoral care and counselling, doesn't so much happen in Papua New Guinea, or how they do it, because they're completely different culture, looks different. I'm sure that it happens, their counselling of each other happens, but it doesn't really happen out that you can really see it. And I suppose that is the same for pastors here. A lot of our pastors don't get thanked for the pastoral care and counselling they do because you simply don't see it. The wives would know how much their husbands, pastors, do, and they would complain about it, I'm sure. But they really have to do a lot, I think, in our country. We have a church which is very reliant on the pastor in many places, and the elders aren't. We have an elders kind of a style church, but they're not. In some places, they're not real strong, and they won't help the pastor carry the burden. It's not only the pastor's job to go and see the sick and the dying. It's all of us. It's the priesthood of all believers. It's part of our role. So it tends to get pushed onto the pastor here in our country, and those things don't happen so well in PNG. The pastor there becomes like a wise man guru. That's his basic role. He becomes like, traditionally you have a big man that's the chief, and then you have a person who kind of sits outside. He's the wise man or the magic man, and so the pastor tends to take up that role traditionally, okay? So ideally you want it no longer to be a magic man, but he has a spiritual influence over the people, okay? Yeah. So he doesn't sit down and pat you on the back kind of thing.
So what were some of the challenges, and did you suffer from malaria?
Oh, yes. Yeah. Well, malaria, firstly, the first year I was there, I had it about 8 times, two times in the first 6 months of the year, and the last 6 months I had it. I had it 6 times in 5 months. I had 6 positive tests. Whether that means I had it 6 times or whether it was the same malaria bug coming back. And by the end of the year, last Christmas, I had to come home on sick leave because I was anemic, and I eventually developed pneumonia. This is to say that malaria is a big problem there. Fortunately, this year I've only had malaria twice. Everybody says it sounds really bad, and it is, but it's kind of like the flu here. The flu kills people, particularly older people. A lot of people, it kills a lot of people in PNG too, particularly young and the old, but it can kill young, healthy people. We had a lady who died of malaria last year because she came down from the highlands and she hadn't built up any resistance to the disease or the bug, parasite, and unfortunately she passed away. Her organs gave way because she kind of tried to fight it, and they wouldn't go off and get medication. Medication's quite expensive. Really good stuff is quite expensive for them, and this year too, there's been a shortage of it where the medical clinics aren't handing it out or are withholding it. And so the chemists and pharmacies around town have gone, yes, and bumped all the prices up, another 10 kina, which is really sad. The people on the coast, though, they live with malaria. If they're lucky enough to get through the first 5 years of their life, the system builds up an immunity, and they have a general resistance to the disease. Yeah. But it kind of it really kind of slowly grates away at you because you're constantly fighting this malaria. You get run down very quickly, and it kind of explains a little bit why their life expectancy is about 60, 63 in Papua New Guinea. Yeah. They don't have lots of old people there.
Is there also, I don't know if it's a cultural thing, but a resistance to medication from like the family? I know I had a friend that had access to TB medication, and the family wanted to treat it using black magic. And
Yeah, there can be. There can be in some places where they will. That's usually kind of up in the more isolated villages that they start to backslide into that thinking. I get told, not only by Papua New Guineans I get told this, but I get told by ex-missionaries who have been there that I should try natural medicines too, to counteract malaria. You chew pawpaw seeds, and there's all sorts of things that they tell you. Your other part of your question was what are the other challenges there? Safety and security is a big one. Most people will think of PNG and think of quite a violent society, and it can be. I've been blessed with the Lord's protection in relation to this up to this point, and I'm very thankful for that. But you know, if you get on the wrong side of people, you can really have some issues. The crime rates have risen there, of course, as the place got independence. Papua New Guinea, all the key-ups from Australia, the police key-ups, got brought out of PNG, and they started to put in their own police force and their own style and way of dealing with problems. You know, you would have real difficulties in trusting the police to do their job. They can be quite corrupt in big ways and in small ways, and they shoot first and ask questions later. There's lots of stories of their turning up at a marketplace to chase a car thief, and a whole heap of people start running, and they just go bang and miss the person running and shoot somebody else. And then, of course, the family of the people that was shot, they go and burn down the police station, and the police station's in ruins. And so the police go and burn down the village. And this just keeps going backwards and forwards. It's incredible. And when I've spoken to some people about how this law and order thing works there, I get some interesting reactions, or they're surprised. You don't initially, they're kind of offensive. They can be kind of offensive because they actually think that this is the way that it should be. I went to the supermarket. I had a little child following me around, and when I first got there, and I went outside, and he followed me outside. I was waiting for a lift to come and pick me up, and he started whispering in pidgin to me, and at that stage I didn't really know what he was saying, but I worked out that he's likely begging for some money. Anyway, the security guard comes up and just grabs him, throws him up against the wall, and goes whack, whack, whack across the face, and not little slaps either, like full on bang. And I'm standing right next to the child. Just, what do I do? Oh, just completely amazed that this has happened in front of me. Anyway, the security guard takes him off the property, the child, and a staff member comes up to me and apologises to me. But they didn't apologise for the security guard. They apologised because the child was begging from me. It's like, what? How can that be? And then I hopped in the car, my lift came, I told him the same story. And he was like, yes, Papua New Guineans have an attitude problem. But he wasn't talking about the security guard. He was talking about the child who'd been beaten up. So, you know, how justice works is kind of turned on its head. And in the story about the police burning down a village, that was justified by the people who I spoke to about it. They said, yes, the police should do that. The police should do that. Because then people are afraid of the police and then they won't do anything wrong. So it's all kind of justified. So these things can be daunting, and it's hard to going back the other way and normalising it, making it normal in life. I was told by counsellors, don't ever normalise that kind of violence in the culture. Don't justify it, etc., etc. And so being shocked by it is actually a good reaction to it. If I wasn't shocked by it, I might be becoming sociopathic or something like that. And desensitised to it, I suppose. I might be a little bit like that anyway, Sam. But it can be daunting. I know Greg Schiller, he never liked talking about those kinds of issues when he came back to Australia because it does kind of get painted in an unfair light. It's really hard to know how much of really violent stuff is happening because it's mostly word of mouth, and so you get the same story 5 or 6 times, but a little bit different, and it might sound like a different story, but it's the same one. And so reported crimes don't get reported so much either, and they say that there's an enormous amount of domestic violence in the country, domestic sexual violence, much of which is unreported. Rape rates are very, very high. There's another question over there. But by the grace of God, we get through.
Yeah. It's kind of it's good to reflect on your own culture to sort of see where our weird things are if you were looking from another lens. And you know, there's things that we do that's weird or odd or not right. Things that don't get reported, like domestic violence and rape and assault and all those sorts of things. But a friend of mine is serving up in the Untitled Chapter and Untitled lands in the top of South Australia, and there was a lady there who had a child, and I think it was like her 6th or 7th child, and she thought, well, I don't have enough money to look after this child, so put it out on a nearby hill. And one of the old ladies said, no, we don't do that anymore. That child is a child that God's given you. Like, we as your family will help you look after that child. And so it's sort of like, I think Christ's light shines on our cultures and their flaws. And it's like you saying, you know, don't accept that that's the way it is in PNG, because there'll be beautiful, wonderful things about that culture that Christ can shine his light on to say that's true and good. But there'll be things that you go, well, actually, no, we don't do that anymore because that's not the way our Lord has called us to serve.
Yeah.
And so it's cool to see those examples, or to be mindful of that, mindful of those examples in other cultures, but also in our own, where you go, no, let's not accept that as, no, it's just our culture. You go, that's, so you're comparing everything to Christ's culture, not, Yeah.
It's a good reminder too that it does happen, the change does happen, but there's sometimes the moments, they don't happen when you expect them to happen. And our success in terms of the gospel is not necessarily about seeing the transformation with our eyes, but proclaiming it with our lips first, and trusting that the change happens, that God's word will work for us, even though we might not be the harvesters of the seed that's been planted. And it's a good reminder for me. In my example, I was frustrated that they just wouldn't make that change at that moment. I could see it as the moment of change for them, but they couldn't. They didn't want to change. Any more questions? We've gone fairly
We've
long.
pretty
hour.
much hit time, unless
Thank you.
someone's really super excited about asking another question.
Good eye. Thank you very much for your time and your attention. You did very well.
Just come back to me for a second so I can pray for you. Yeah, if you just lie down.
I'm afraid of what people might think.
You can stand as an equal child of God with me. That's all right. We'll pray. Gracious Father, we thank you for this calling upon Mick's life to teach your word in Papua New Guinea in a different culture, one that at times he has found very challenging, and he's shared some of that with us today. But also I'm sure it's rewarding to see your word get preached over there, to see people excited to hear the gospel, to live as children of Christ, and that he gets to play a part in that. So we thank you for what he shared today, for answering all the questions we've had and sharing what it looks like to be a child of God out in this world, shining your light, even in a place that is, according to statistics, 95% Christian. We wonder how our country is going, and we look at that country and on paper we'd think, well, they've all heard the gospel, but we hear the stories from Mick still that some of those old ways are still there, that we all so easily fall back into our old sinful self when we know that's true for ourselves as well. So we thank you for that challenge to each of us in our own lives. So as he continues his furlough here in Australia, may you refresh him, give him good health, times of catching up with friends and family, ready to return to PNG and continue to do your work over there. And as he's with us for the rest of camp as well, just help us to bring your word to him in this time here so that he can be refreshed through it as well. We pray in Jesus' name. Amen.